types inform our action in such a way that I know others directly in a pre-reflexive manner. I don't really think about the fireman. I know immediately what he is. And I know myself, that is the mirroring effect, I know myself reflectively. I understand myself as person in danger when I look at this guy yelling into my face, even though he's saying something that is blatantly obvious. Okay. Now these typifications are reciprocal. I hope this is not water. Oh. Well, too bad. So, and I'll just continue to make sense and so on. It will be boring, but if you want something else, just bring me something else to drink. Okay. And then the fourth point is that the two typificatory schemes enter into an ongoing negotiation in the face-to-face situation. So I'll come back to an example of this, but it means that even though the types have a certain stability in the heat of the moment or through continuous interaction, these types may change. Yes, thank you. Okay, so I'll take the water nonetheless. Okay, and now let me see where I was. I believe that's where I was. Okay. Now in my example, I've used roles as illustration of types, right? So I've spoken about the role of somebody as a fireman, and my own role, by the way, as a common inhabitant of a block of flats. But Schütz identified three different kinds of types. There are types of characterology. Somebody typically acts in this or that way. Somebody has a bad humor, for instance. Or people well, you can think of people in types of function, like, for instance, the roles that I've already used as example. Or there are also types of collectivity. So, rightly or not, you think of typical Frenchman as being like that, or the American like that or that, and so on. What Schütz doesn't say, if my memory serves me well, is that we also act according to types or generalities of value. That is, of estimated greatness or smallness with respect to types of ideals. In taking advice on that funny itching you feel, your doctor and your neighbor give you something called advice. However, the doctor's advice is greater on the scale of the ideal type of really valuable advice than your neighbor's advice is, all right? And it is certainly not immaterial to note how the greatness of the doctor is stated, reaffirmed, and recognized through the material paraphernalia that surrounds her. The stethoscope, the white jacket, but also the waiting room, the time schedule, the place in which to do the innocent striptease, the BMW, the certificates on the wall, the rituals of hygiene, and so on and so forth. These are all ways in which your relation to that type of person typically is mediated. All of these inform not only the role of the GP, but the valuation, the consolidated recognition of greatness of that role. I shall come to this back again in the conclusion. Now, following my hypotheses, and already suggested in my last example, human beings form relations with objects over a similar range as they form with human beings. Let me illustrate this. On the one end of the spectrum, think of that old jersey that your grandmother knitted for you in the months before she died. It doesn't matter how many holes there are in it, or how many times your friends give you gift vouchers for something fashionable, they simply miss the point. Such objects cannot be bought, their value is not communicatable, not transferable, not replaceable, it is not typical. On the other end of the spectrum is the type male jersey, size medium, homemade, for which you can tick off a box on the form on which you declare the value of your assets in applying for house insurance. So much this latter refers to an anonymous type that one may wonder if it is at all possible to possess something exactly like it. Well, the good thing is at least that if it is difficult to possess such an absolutely anonymous type jersey, someone is nonetheless ready to insure it for you. Right, so the type has social reality and informs your interaction. Just look at your bills at the end of the month. You will see that I am right. Now, the same can be developed for a myriad of artifacts, practically all of the artifacts that surround us. Having explained this parallel development on the scope of human-human relations and human-artifact relations, a couple of general remarks about the dimensions of the social world are in order. As in human-human relations, this is the first point, the difference between intimate experience of the particularities of the things and transmitted or self-generated typologies of the things are important in provoking responses from the people who interact with them. In the relation with architects as types, the latter shows the same variety of character, function, collectivity, and value types as present in human relations. In fact, as I've shown you with the example of the doctor, the objects tend to inform, embody, and support and justify these relations. Yes. Okay, I'll leave that point. Having discussed typologies, it is nonetheless crucial to insist on the fact that closeness is not, closeness is not equal to intimacy, and intimacy is not necessarily equal to non-typification. Let me give you an example. I happen to be very close to my wife, but I regrettably do not spend all of my time in intimate proximity to her. During the times of separation, for instance, our relation is suspended, like tonight, and I'm counting on a typical idea that I have of her. Like, for instance, she's the typical kind of wife that doesn't like, for instance, the typical postman type of guy when I am not there. Right. That is why I can afford to drink water and not something stronger at this moment. Furthermore, relations between types remain open to the negotiations and improvisations that make of human beings such interesting creatures. Recall, for instance, how last year, managing director of the International Monetary Fund type of guy engaged with a cleaner of his hotel room kind of woman in a negotiated, not so typical type of interaction. Human beings can negotiate their roles, if you know what I mean. As little as I want to reduce human interaction to the use and play with types, so little do I aim at implying an authenticity of the face-to-face, as if all relations ideally have to be brought back to this. It cannot, and it never will. And the same holds for our relations to objects. One of the reasons why social reality is unthinkable without some or other notion of type, standard, or norm is that these types and the typical responses they tend to solicit are responsible for coordinating action in society. Without recourse to such notions, be they associated with people or with artifacts, it would be completely impossible to account for the fact that society remains more or less ordered, that in society we do not live in a chaotic, unintelligible free-for-all. Now, let us move on to what you have been waiting for all of the time. I want to speak about buildings. Let me get back to the ways in which interaction is informed by artifacts. I move away from jerseys and stethoscopes and look at buildings. I need hardly to convince you of all that people have this range of relations from intimate to anonymous with buildings. According to the dialectic of dwelling and building, familiar to all of those of you who work in theory of architecture, people make themselves at home in different places by careful arrangement of the things and people around them. Have you ever thought about that lady's life? That is Kamala Parker Bowles. She has immense challenges in getting, finding herself at home in that house she happens to live in from time to time. Other people have other kinds of challenges. These are people living in a forest in Hungary. The fact of the matter is, people are constantly making themselves at home by arranging people and stuff around them. This happens not only at home, but also in any place in which I may spend some time in. My cubicle at work, a coffee shop, or my car, I don't know if you have furs and a tissue box in your car, Yes. So we do that too. We make ourselves at home there. We make ourselves with others in home in the places where we live, as far as is possible. And it is far from a trivial fact that we do not need architects to do so. And most of the time, we do not make use of their services to help us to do so. Now, I don't say this to belittle the work of architects, but to insist on the anthropological primacy of what I had earlier called the ongoing process or processes of human habitation. In order to work my way towards a qualification of these categorical remarks, let me point out that not all situations lend themselves equally to such appropriation by the people who inhabit them. In fact, some places seem to be purposely designed to resist such efforts. Think, for instance, of airport hotels, shopping malls, cemeteries, and my personal favorite, the offices of the Department of Home Affairs. Standardization is the general trait of these places. They were made not for you, but for the idea that someone had of a type like you. What my ironic examples may obscure is that I do not at all wish to evoke a value judgment of the nature personalized is good, standardized is bad. Standardization helps a lot to communicate equality and fairness. Think, for instance, in an ideal classroom where the seats of the class are arranged in such a way that they communicate the equality of the learners with respect to the state that gives a subsidy for their teaching. Standardization, or design through types, is also indispensable to make our environment readable. I mean, you couldn't imagine the hell that this city would have been if all of the petrol service stations had been designed by Bernard Tschumi. What I would claim is that personalization and standardization refer to the extreme points on a spectrum of anthropological possibilities with respect to our basic relations to the habitable environment and to constructions. The continuous process of human habitation, I say, spans the possibilities between intimate personalization and typological standardization. And earlier, I pointed out that not everybody has the same relation to objects as everybody else. I mean, there is the easiest way to explain this. The meaning of the door of the, closing the loo means something quite different if you are sitting on the inside or if you are waiting on the outside. All right. Now, let me give you just another example. For its passengers, the Airbus is a means of transport. For the air stewards, their office, for the managers of the Airbus company, a project and a product. Yet for all of them, the Airbus is a mediatory artifact that facilitates in whatever way their continuous efforts to be and become at home in the world with others. Facilitates or frustrates their relation to the world and others. It follows quite unproblematically from this observation that a variety of people who will engage with any building will do so in different ways. Very pertinent here are the different relations that the architect and the client have to the same building. If my preceding observations are generally correct, then we could conclude that the difference between the architect and the client would consist at least of the two following features. What is primary, that I've said from the beginning, is a continuous process of habitation of the client and other stakeholders. It is also conferred to all of those who would then, in meaningful way, be said to be made into stakeholders of the intervention that a new building will entail into their own life. Concerned public, the homeless, the taxpayers, mere passers-by, and so on and so forth. What the architect is and even should be depends on this primary event into which the architect can intervene. Okay, so there you have it. The primary process of habitation and the architect as practicing a responsive intervention. The second important difference between client and architect with respect to the same building is as follows. The different inhabitants and other users of a building can all, to a greater or a lesser extent, gradually develop the whole range from intimate, personalized to episodic or anonymous relations to that construction. But the architect, as architect of that construction, cannot. He or she can only, with some margin of variation, engage with the building that is to be built as an anonymous object. So that is the spectrum that I have described to you from the beginning. The architect there has a void there. Now, someone may ask, what do you mean? Do architects not have personal briefs, design briefs that they receive from the clients? Well, yes, but these are briefs for what clients consider their typical interests to be. This means that however much architects would like to design homes, they can only design houses. In this sense, that I will qualify, but in this sense, architecture is not an art of particularity. It is a practice concerned with types or generalities. A quick examination of the human artifact and human-human relations involved in the practice of design and construction overseen by architects should suffice to support this point. I take up that characterization of the practice of architecture. As far as architecture concerns the design and construction of artifacts, it is intimately concerned with compliance with types of cost-efficient, the optimization of cost-efficiency, safety requirements imposed by law, building regulations, as imposed on all buildings of a certain type, regulations and standards imposed by the city's urban plan, specifying maximum density of construction, forms of roads, and so on and so forth. And I think this holds even to a certain extent in the case of aesthetic standards, but I shall not develop that here. Look at that building. I cited these two pictures earlier on as examples of joyous creativity in architecture, right? You will recognize this building from Gordy. No problem typifying Gordy's architecture as Gordy, but look there, standard windows, standard ways of closing windows, standard requirements for the balcony, vertical walls having to do with cost efficiency, and so on and so forth. Once you have opened your eyes to it, you will see those types absolutely everywhere. But these types also work for the human relations involved, and even when designing, this is true even when designing for one particular client, when the practice of architecture requires that not only the client, but also the next owner, that is the typical, probable next owner of and the typical member of public, and the typical whatever other stakeholders should be taken into consideration in the design. In designing the specifics of average human bodies, in designing the specifics of average human bodies and typical traits of ergonomics have to be reckoned with. I mean, take this detail from a bathroom of 100 Wasser. You will see there the wash basins all on exactly the same level, a level suitable for human use, the mirrors exactly fitting them, because that is more or less what the human body looks like. But apart from that, see there the evacuation of water is absolutely standard. The surfaces of the bathroom wall fits with the type of requirements needed for cleaning and hygiene, and you can continue that despite the immediate appearance that 100 Wasser inevitably makes on you. Okay. Now this de facto, no, I have an exception here, or something interesting to add. In this respect, it is telling to consider an architect whose work is synonymous with the effort to overcome the dominant role of types and standards in order to encounter the client in the particularities of his or her life. I'm thinking of certain of the buildings of Laurie Baker. His practice strikes exactly because of the dramatic ways in which it sometimes departs from what we would recognize as the contemporary institutionalized profession of architecture. So he said to some of his clients, you have a door, let me design for you in 10 minutes a house around it. That is the best we can do. Okay, I encounter you on something that is very particular and intimate to you, that door that you happen to possess. But even here, the designs are informed by typologies derived from the human body or from the architect's impression about what Indian culture is like, and so on and so forth. This de facto restriction of the architect to, or at least the predominance of types and generalities in design, and the essential difference between the architect and the respective uses and appropriations of the architect's work, seem to me to be constitutive of the practice of architecture. But having arrived at this conclusion, have I not now made full circle, and instead of avoiding the typological approach to architecture, as promised at the beginning of this presentation, have I not simply accomplished it? Why am I creaking like that? Do you also hear that, or is it in my head? It just happens. Okay, let's pretend it's not there. Well, I've no intention to go into this simple